Well, I believe we are starting the live stream now, and we will give people a moment to trickle in. Now that is a Tuesday morning event at 9 a.m. So we'll give people enough time to join us for this discussion today. Okay. But for us, we will start around 9 o'clock local. Oh, now we're started. Okay, all right. Well, we're going to give people a minute or so to trickle in before we start the formal seminar at 9 a.m. sharp Eastern time, so we can see that people are joining the discussion. Hopefully, a lot of people will be joining us today. And I do see a lot of familiar names. Hi, good morning, everybody. Okay, well, people are coming in. Great. Okay, well, give it a little bit more time for people to join. Okay, I think I'm seeing the number becoming a little bit more slowly to come in. Okay, I think we'll just get started. Good morning, everybody. It's a wonderful Tuesday morning here in Washington. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion on a critical issue for the future of Myanmar and also for the future of the resistance as we know it and call it. And that is the sustainable funding for the NUG, National Unity Government of Myanmar. We know that the coup has been there. The military government has taken over the country for more than 2 years now, and what we have seen is really the prosperity or the very widespread nationwide resistance movement against the military, both in terms of the political movement and in terms of the military resistance. So part of our program, our ongoing program on Myanmar, is to organize academic research, host a public discussion, and to stimulate debate about the development of the country, what is happening and what should happen, and what are the directions that things are going. Through our program, we very actively try to involve a specialist on Myanmar from both in and outside the region, inside Southeast Asia and outside Southeast Asia. And we also try very hard to involve the next generation of Burmese scholars who are currently, a lot of them are currently in exile outside the country, to participate in this type of policy discussion. So the hope is that we will raise awareness about the prolonged state of civil war in the country, because let's face it, after more than 2 years after the coup, a lot of organizations or a lot of people are losing hope as for how long the state of darkness will continue in the country, and when we're ever going to see hope in the country again. We want to keep people focused and briefed on the development, and also facilitate informed discussions about the future of the country. So today we're going to cover a critical issue, like I mentioned, that is the sustainable funding for NUG. We know that NUG has adopted very innovative approaches in terms of their fundraising. That includes issuing bonds, using fintech, using crowdsourcing that a lot of analysts and a lot of organizations have written about, and things even creative as cryptocurrencies or even real estate auctions. In a way, NUG is raising their funding as if it is a de facto government without necessarily managing or administering most of the territories that it claims to represent. And this also raises a question as for whether these innovative approaches have been effective in the face of the military junta's effort to intercept and deter potential funders. And it also raises a question, I'm sure, on a lot of people's mind, that where is foreign aid? Where is the foreign support for the NUG in their armed resistance against the military government? So to discuss these questions, we have the best expert on this issue. Professor Zachary Abuja, who is a professor at National War College in Washington, D.C., where he specializes in Southeast Asian politics and security affairs. He is concurrently an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's War School of Foreign Affairs. He's the author of 5 books, 5 monographs, and hundreds of articles. And his forthcoming study on the People's Army of Vietnam is expected in late 2023. For this specific topic, Zach has written a very interesting paper illustrating his thoughts and his analysis based on comprehensive and long-term studies and a lot of field conversations with people involved in the sustainable funding for NUG. So it's an extremely well-informed paper, which I suggest that everyone should give it a read. Our staff will be posting the link to the paper in the chat box. So in terms of the today's discussion, I encourage everybody to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to raise your questions if you have any. For the format today, we're going to give Professor Abuja about 10 to 15 minutes to tell us his thoughts and his analysis about this issue. And then Zach and I are going to have a very brief moderated discussion as for some of the questions and some of the key issues as included in his paper. And then for the last 20-25 minutes, we will open up for the Q&A. So with that, without further ado, I give the screen to Professor Abuja. Thank you so much, Zach.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Yun. I need to start with my 2 disclaimers. The first is these are my personal views and not the views of the U.S. Department of Defense or U.S. government, though I wish they were. And the second is I am not a Myanmar specialist by any means. And so I come at this with great humility. I have studied political violence and politics and security in Southeast Asia now for almost 30 years. And I do approach it with a comparative lens. And I have studied how sub-state actors and militant groups have funded themselves since the mid-1990s when I was a grad student in Cambodia, traipsing through the jungle looking at Khmer Rouge mining operations. And I can tell you that I've never seen such innovative, creative, thoughtful fundraising as what the NUG has put in place in the past 2 years. And I'd like really for people to understand how important this is, not just to sustain their revolution, but they always have to keep an eye on the future of the country. They will prevail. They will win. There's no way the military can win this. And so you kind of juxtapose the dinosaurs within the military that have run the economy into the ground. They have eviscerated a decade's worth of steady economic growth, more than half the population living in poverty since the coup. And you juxtapose that economic mismanagement with some of the creativity, the tech savviness of the NUG leadership and their advisors. And you know that the country once again will be in good hands, but it's going to be a long slog. I don't have time to go over the state of the conflict. Everyone in this room is aware that we are in for a very long slog. The military cannot win this. They are fighting a multi-front war. They're trying to terrorize the population into submission through their 4-cut strategy, and it is failing. Even by their own admission, it's failing. 132 of the 330 townships, or 42% of the country, have security concerns, according to Min Aung Hlaing. 47 townships are under martial law. And we know the military has just given themselves a 51% increase in their budget to $2.7 billion, which is, enormous. They certainly cannot afford it, but they're desperate to win this war. I hope all of you have looked at the fantastic new report by Tom Andrews of the United Nations that has shown in very clear detail the importation of over $1 billion of weaponry since the coup is continuing. There are multiple sources. And, the military has not just that, they have their offline sources of revenue. They have their two conglomerates, though they are both hurting. They can have other things at their disposal. They don't have to pay in dollars. They have currency swaps. There can be barter trade. And the country still has around $5 billion at least in its reserves. So, that's where we are. The question I want to raise, how does the NUG fund the revolution? Because war is not cheap, even a guerrilla war. The reality is the United States has been sitting on $1.1 billion of money belonging to the people of Myanmar that was parked in the US Federal Reserve. The NUG has not been able to secure that funding. They have not even, I have recommended to the US government that they get a line of credit against it, and that hasn't worked either. But we know that NUG is funding itself. There was a recent piece by Tony Davis in the Asia Times, which makes a very clear case that the PDFs are getting weapons and ammunition in a steady supply, but again, costly. We're talking about 3 to 4 times the price of pre-coup black market weaponry. So the NUG has had to be very creative. And as you mentioned before, they've tried to raise funds as if they are the state. They have eschewed any illicit activity, and you know how important that is right now in Myanmar. Synthetic drugs, heroin are pouring out of the country in record amounts. We have record seizures across Southeast Asia on almost a weekly basis, and yet prices are still going down. So a lot more is getting through. So let me talk very briefly about the 6 ways that the NUG has been trying to raise funds. The first is through a spring lottery, simply taking advantage of the country's love of numbers, love of lotteries. And this, of course, also by having their own online or digital lottery, took money away from state coffers because people were doing this. Unfortunately, that required the use of the banking system, and the military very quickly shut that down. And that really hurt the NUG because that was going to give them kind of that annuity, that monthly regular stream of income that they could always count on. The second way they've raised money is through crypto bonds. These have been issued in the Czech Republic. They've raised around $50 million so far. These are zero interest bonds. They do not pay anything. People are buying them out of nothing more than a patriotic appeal. And I've often wondered and spoken to the NUG and said, have you considered actually having a coupon on these bonds, and so that you might get some investors interested? Not a lot, but is this something you would consider? And so it's something that for now they're trying to simply appeal to the patriotism of the people, but there are other things they can consider. They have been selling land, and some of it is quite playful. So Min Aung Hlaing, for example, illegally appropriated a villa in Yangon, and the NUG sold $100 shares in this, raising $5 million. But there are so many other military properties that they own property all throughout the country, choice locations in downtown Yangon and Mandalay. And, one of the things that the NUG really has going for it is they have all these professionals at their disposal, land surveyors, architects, accountants, who can sit there and propose different types of multi-use developments or apartment complexes, or, simply auctioning off the land. And they have a very good sense of what the value of these properties are. And again, they've been doing these online auctions, and they're selling like hotcakes. Within 18 hours of the last one, they sold 96% of the units, raising $10 million. So this is happening on a regular basis. So far, they've only done these in Yangon and Mandalay, but I am told that they are going to continue these throughout the country. They're just kind of working with local officials and trying to get some of that figured out. Again, this is a leap of faith. You're buying something that doesn't yet exist. And technically, the NUG doesn't physically even control that territory. Properties have not been built, and yet people are doing this, buying land. There is a lot of land right now that is being developed in planning by the NUG. 10 acres that was home to the military's archive, 30 acres that was the former home of the Defense Forces Academy. So there is real land out there. The next way they've raised money is through mining rights, and they've identified 45 different mines throughout the country and put those up for auction. The first one was auctioned in February of this year, and it raised $5 million. It's outside of Mandalay near Shan State. And it's a 51-49 joint venture between the NUG and the company that bought it. Now, again, this is an even greater leap of faith, because one of the things about mining is it's a finite resource. And so should the military identify what these auctioned sites are, they have every reason and every incentive to go in and mine like hell and try to deplete those resources. And if they could do that 1 or 2 times, that would be a real deterrent for other investors. The next way that they've tried to raise money is through taxation. And taxation is always that bond between the state and society. Right now, the NUG has implemented tax collection in 38 of the country's 330 townships. They've raised a small amount. It's around $1.5 million through taxes. And they've been trying to do this in a very creative, thoughtful, and tech-savvy way, issuing digital receipts to individuals and companies that are paying voluntary taxes. But again, this is tricky because it's contested space. And the last thing the NUG, which enjoys very high rates of legitimacy and popular support, should they overtax or tax people when they're already being taxed by the state, the SAC, that's going to cause problems. And especially when you think about the overall contraction of the economy, how hard hit farmers are with import controls and not being able to purchase fertilizers and pesticides, what that's done to rural incomes. We also know that the SAC has gone after businessmen who have made donations to the PDFs and NUG with particular vengeance, trying to make examples of them. The final way they've tried to raise money is through lawfare. And so, for example, there are around $80 to $100 million in monthly rents to the Ministry of Oil and Gas Enterprises. The NUG is thinking about going after this through the Singaporean Arbitration Center. While I think this is actually, lawfare is very clever, I would caution them to be much smarter about the venues that they are going to pursue this. There's not a snowball's chance in Singapore that the arbitration center there is going to rule in favor of the NUG at the expense of a major corporation like the PTTP of Thailand. We've also seen them trying to pressure international brewers who are paying taxes in the country. And, it would be smart for companies that are thinking about the shadow of the future to get on side and start to make some side payments to the NUG. Now, despite all of the success in fundraising, there are some problems. The $100 million they used last year, it's gone. War is just that expensive. And so the need to continuously raise money and be creative doesn't stop. The second thing is that the diaspora is pretty tapped out. All my friends in the United States have been hit repeatedly. And if there is that major global recession, it's going to get a lot harder for those donations. The third problem is that moving money internationally is really hard. NUG has done a great job raising money, but actually getting, what you can earn from a crypto bond coming out of the Czech Republic and turning it into cash to buy an AK-47 in the jungles of Shan State, is a different proposition. And so creating those ability to move money is not easy, especially after 9/11, when greater compliance reforms in the banking system. We have the September 2022 Financial Action Task Force blacklisting of the country, which has hurt the SAC, but it's also hurt the NUG. NUG Pay, an app developed by the NUG, is innovative, but it's been cumbersome. It requires licensed agents. It's fine for donations, but it's been very clunky to actually move money around. And it is tied to tethered cryptocurrencies, but it's not the system that they thought it was going to be. Finally, the fact that the regime is now paying real attention to NUG fundraising. They see it as the NUG's real Achilles heel. We know that they have parked a bunch of lieutenant colonels in the central bank. In fact, they have colonels across all the different banks in the country, whether state-owned banks, now down to private banks. They're there monitoring any banking transaction over 100,000 chat, or roughly $45 US. They've been imposing draconian fines and prison terms. 10 years is pretty much the norm now, including for young people, children, making small donations in single-digit dollar terms. They haven't been able to stop the purchase of land or bonds. That's beyond their technical means. But they're certainly trying to punish the people they catch doing that. They put a lot of pressure on the mobile banking payments, especially Wave and KBZ Pay. The military has pressured all of these mobile banking platforms, demanding they keep complete records of transfers, personal identification, including government identification numbers, name, addresses, photographs, for all mobile wallet customers. The government has tried to make sure that all SIM cards are registered to people, so people can't have anonymous or SIM cards anymore, or it's getting a lot harder. If you are going to try to move money through these mobile platforms, they have different levels. So if you are at this level, you can only move a certain amount of money. At this level, you can move more money through it. But at each level, there's greater demand for who you are and your personal identification. And then on top of that, at KBZ Bank, we have an additional way to monitor transactions, and that is the whole platform system is run by Huawei. And we can just assume that they are in bed with the junta. So even if the banks might not want to comply with all the demands for who the people are, the reality is that the military has a very clear picture of what's happening in the banking system. Let me conclude with just one tidbit, and this is something that's actually gives me a little bit of hope. The NUG is established, or hopefully soon will establish, something called the Spring Bank. This is trying to alleviate some of the problems and weaknesses that they had with NUG Pay. This is going to be a full service online bank. It will be run on blockchain Web3, and it will issue stable coins that are tied to the US dollar, Singapore dollar, Thai baht, as well as the Myanmar chat to back transactions. It will offer customers foreign exchange, remittances, fixed deposits, gold saving plans, online payments via Visa and MasterCard. So I think and this is going to be the platform that people will be able to purchase the lottery once again, apartments or bonds that are auctioned. So this is very important that they get this up and running. They're spending a lot of time to make sure this happens. But here's the really interesting thing. For the reserves, they have been allowed to get access to that $1.1 billion that's parked in the United States. So that is going to be the reserves of this bank. So the NUG did make some limited progress with the United States. So let me leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zach. What a fascinating study. And I'm sure a lot of time and work went into finding out the nitty-gritty, the details about the transactions and how they have been implemented. And thank you so much for that very comprehensive overview, and also a very realistic and sobering assessment about the obstacles and the challenges that they face. If I may raise the question, because we're talking about sustainable funding for NUG, right? And we know that in the past 2 years, the funding has sustained one way or the other, probably not sufficiently, but there was funding. But how long do you think that this sustainability will last? Because some of the issues like real estate auction and taxation, because NUG does not actually control the land, does not actually control the territory, it will make them, well, people might contribute their funding out of patriotism, but looking at the specifics of the transaction, how sustainable are these approaches will be down the road? What's your assessment?
Let me start with taxation. Yes, the NUG doesn't control a lot of territory. And again, they have to be very careful with taxation. But to be fair, neither does the military government. There are different studies. The Advisory Council on Myanmar, came out and said that the military doesn't have effective control over half the country right now. The Free Burma Rangers actually came out with I think a better assessment, is simply saying, okay, the military is trying to control certain nodes of communication, and there's nowhere the military cannot get to in the country, but they can't hold it. And I'd say that's kind of true with the NUG as well. In fact, I think it's dangerous for the NUG given their limitations in ammunition and arms, to try to hold territory right now. So taxation is not as sustainable as it should be. The bonds, eventually the diaspora community is going to be tapped out. And, the economy of Myanmar is growing again, after an 18% contraction after the coup. It grew 2% last year. I think it's predicted to grow 3% this year. So there's some money, but certainly the regime is paying very close attention to whoever is within the country making donations or buying bonds or buying land. And you can imagine that, they don't have great cyber capabilities, but you could imagine that they're trying to figure out how to hack into these systems and disrupt the networks. So none of this is very sustainable. And that's why I'm very concerned about the NUG. They have the legitimacy, they have the support of the people, they have a just cause. We often say in insurgency, the state might have the watch, but it's the insurgents that have the time. And I'm not sure that's true in this case. I really think that the state has so many inherent advantages in its ability to raise money, borrow from abroad. The state system still favors the government. They have a better ability to tax corporations. Unfortunately, foreign corporations are still making investments in that country, not existing ones, but new investments, which to me is utterly shameful. So the government does have streams of revenue. So I am concerned about how sustainable this is and why it's so important that the NUG thinks not just about good tactics, but about good strategy.
Well, that's a whole another interesting issue that we can discuss, because you mentioned that Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that the military is not winning this. But I guess a counter question to that is how is the military losing this? That currently we're looking at a stalemate, and the government does enjoy so much inherent advantages being the actual government of the country, and it puts the insurgency in an extremely disadvantaged position in this particular case. And that brings us here to another question, which is the issue of foreign assistance. That we saw what NDAA and Burma Act included last year, and there have been a lot of questions being asked that where is the money and where is the promised assistance? That if the internal situation does not really give us a lot of leeways or a lot of space to create sustainable funding for NUG, do you see that foreign assistance could be such a source?
I think it's absolutely shameful that the international community has provided so little support for the NUG. Absolutely shameful. My own government included. No one is going to provide lethal assistance to the NUG. And there are many reasons for this. Right now, the United States is simply between Ukraine and the military assistance. There's just the US military is kind of balking about the amount of stuff that's going to Ukraine and not into its own arsenal and for training and for other contingencies. So that's not going to happen. And that's why I don't like to even raise the specter of lethal assistance to the NUG, because they're not going to get it. And if the United States isn't going to get it, so the Europeans certainly not, the Australians are not, no ASEAN country will. So it's off the table. And I don't ever want to give the people of Myanmar false hope. And I really hope that they understand that they're what you see is what you get. The US is not going to do any more than what we're doing. The other thing is that because of the EROs, and the US government just is not able to differentiate between the different EROs very effectively. And too many of them are involved in illicit narcotics at a time when, you get a couple 100,000 overdose deaths in the United States, and no one's going to back that. It's just a nightmare scenario for the US government. But there is the potential for non-lethal assistance, and the National Defense Authorization Act of 2023 had something called the Burma Bill. Now, this is very different than the Taiwan Act, which provides $10 billion to the Taiwanese people. There's over a 5-year period of time for their defense. There's nothing like that in the Burma Bill. We're talking around small change. But remember, this is an act of Congress, and it's the executive's branch to conduct foreign policy. Congress has authorized the executive branch, the president, and the different executive agencies to spend money on the NUG for non-lethal assistance. But so far, it's stalled. It's sitting nowhere. There are arguments going on. What constitutes lethal assistance? Are communications devices lethal assistance? What about some radar? Because we know that the field grade radar systems, because we know that the military has increased their use of aerial attacks on civilian populations. So could we give some forewarning? And this is all sitting within the US interagency, and it's absolutely maddening, because people are dying every day, and we're dithering here in Washington, and they deserve the ability to defend themselves. The other thing is that if we increase support for the NUG's nascent civil administration, their law enforcement, the judges, the healthcare system on the ground. We're still in the middle of a pandemic. This is a region where you get zoonotic diseases The healthcare system in Myanmar in the best of days is woefully underfunded. The military just gave themselves a 50% raise. Where's the money coming from? And so I think anything the United States, the European Union, other ASEAN countries, Japan could do to support the civil administration there is so important. Because that allows the NUG to really concentrate their limited funds on the war effort, and they need to win the war.
Well, with that picture, I think we're going to open up for Q&A. I think there are a lot of questions, even here in Washington, about what U.S. assistance will look like, whether that includes, well, we have seen callings for the U.S. government to provide weapons to NUG and to some of the PDF. Excuse me. But eventually, thank you. Eventually, what will come through, I think that's still a very big question. We hosted a workshop among next generation Burmese scholars in Washington earlier this month, and that is a question that everybody was asking: that when is the U.S. assistance coming through, and what it will look like. But unfortunately, it seems the answer from everywhere that we asked is that, well, what you see is what you get, and what we're seeing is not a lot. So with that, I think we're going to open up for Q&A again. For any of the if any of the participants in the audience has a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we will go into the questions. And there is a question about the relationship between the ERO or the EAOs and the NUG and the PDFs. And the question is, do we know if the EAOs participate in funding the NUG or the PDFs directly? They have a very contentious relationship and depends on which EAOs we're talking about. But Zach, what do you think? Do they fund the NUG directly?
Most of the EAOs are funding themselves for their own operations. And remember, there are a range of different EAOs out there. There are some that are fully supportive with the NUG, committed to their goal of establishing a federal republic there, and are actively fighting alongside. And the NUG was actually very smart in some places, because they don't have a lot of military experience, put some of their PDFs under those commands. And in those places, the EAOs have supported and armed and provide ammunition. So yes, there is that. There are some EAOs out there that are tacitly supporting the NUG, but not fighting. Sometimes they will arm and train the PDFs quietly. They fight in self-defense. Such as the TNLA, for example, Arakan Army have both done this, very active in arming and equipping the PDFs, but so far are not fighting themselves. And then you have a bunch of the National Ceasefire Agreement groups, EAOs, much smaller, less important militarily. They're anti that NUG, are certainly benefiting from the lawlessness and still working with NAPADA. So every organization is different. I think that most of the EAOs are still very much focused on their own fundraising, whether it's through the auctioning of land rights, timber rights, mining, some illicit narcotics, other trafficking.
Yeah, that's what I understand as well. There seems to be a lot of assistance, a lot of training and hosting on the ground in terms of PDF, but direct funding support to the PDFs and NUG, that really depends on which organization you're talking about. And remember, EAOs are not famous for giving funding away to others. They might provide some weaponry and assist and training to these nascent fighting forces of the NUG and the PDF, but providing funding directly, that seems to be a primary field running outside the scope of the EAOs. Is that your understanding as well, Zach?
I would agree with that. Look, right now there are several key EAOs whose interests are aligned with the NUG. And the NUG has better relations and more trust with key EAOs than any other government of Myanmar in the past. But there is historic mistrust. There are histories of betrayals. And this, for the NUG, the alliance they have with these EAOs is really their greatest strength, other than their popular legitimacy. But it's also their greatest vulnerability. And you could imagine that the SAC is focusing very hard on sowing divisions and kind of creating rifts and false flag operations, and whatever they have to do. If I was in the SAC, this would be one of my key lines of effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially for some of the stronger and wealthier yields in the north, like UWSA, I think they're under pretty strict instruction from, for example, China, not to provide funding or not to provide financial assistance to NUG, even if there is a natural born or a natural sense of sympathy towards NUG to begin with. But my understanding is that these organizations close to China are in active negotiation with SAC in terms of their continued ceasefire or the maintenance of the status quo. So for them to basically stay out of the civil war is also not in NUG's favor.
Right. The Chinese have really put a lot of pressure. They've hosted 2 meetings recently with 7 different EAOs. And again, what I've been told about those meetings is the Chinese have said it's okay to fight back in self-defense. You're allowed to defend yourself with the military interests of your territory, but you have to stop offensive operations and you have to stop your active support for the NUG. The Chinese have, after a couple of years of hedging their bets, have gone full in with the SAC. They want their pipelines secure, they want their railroad, they want their port, they want the hydroelectric projects, they want other electricity projects with the SAC. That's a very, there's a lot of fiber optic cables that are going to be laid through Myanmar when China thinks about their digital Silk Road. So the Chinese have really doubled down on the SAC and are trying to put pressure on the EAOs to really dial back their support for the NUG.
Yeah, and it's tilting the scale in the SAC's favor in reality, no matter how the Chinese claim that our neutrality is not going to affect the domestic development on the ground. Well, to continue this, there are a couple of questions about this $1.1 billion US dollars frozen by the United States. You mentioned that this money could be used as a reserve by the NUG for this new bank. Do you have any details as for how that would come along or how that would look like? And also, in terms of the U.S. position, would that suggest a major softening of the U.S. position towards NUG? Since we already discussed that non-military or non-lethal support is pretty thin in this area as well. Basically, other than this, well, first off, what does this $1.1 billion really entail? What does it mean? And 2, anything else other than this?
So the $1.1 billion just happened to be part of Myanmar's central bank reserves that was parked in the New York Federal Reserve at the time of the coup. And it's normal. I mean, I think of at the time of the coup, the country had around $7.5 billion in foreign reserves. The NLD government did a very good job in building up in their short period of ruling the country. And they had some, I assume, in Japan, some elsewhere. It's smart to have your money spread out. In the United States, and please remember the coup happened just 10 days after the Biden administration was inaugurated. So this was and after the U.S. government and our foreign policy bureaucracy was so decimated under the previous administration. But there was some very fast thinking people within the Federal Reserve and US Treasury that froze that funds. It belongs to the people of Myanmar, full stop. It is their money. The issue is who is the lawful government of Myanmar. And right now, the US government has simply frozen it. We could not get the Japanese to follow suit. We couldn't get anyone else to follow suit. Despite how little the United States has done for the people of Myanmar since the coup, we've still done a lot more than anyone else, which is troubling. The one thing I'm not at liberty to explain some of the details about how that $1.1 billion could be used as the reserves of the Spring Bank, but let me just sum up. It would be through correspondence accounts in the United States.
Okay, we will see what that comes out and what that will look like. You mentioned about this NUG basically acting as a government without actually administering the state or being the state. That raises a question that, we are all, everyone of us here in Washington focuses on the sanctions, right? And what it means for example, the state-owned oil companies like Mogi and some of the other the military-controlled banks. So in terms of these revenues that the military government continues to roll in from Thailand, from China, from other countries, do you see any possibility that NUG can get access to them? Or this is the part of the revenue of the government that's completely off limit for the NUG? There's no way.
Again, they're trying to do this through the lawfare. So, that you have the PTT from Thailand paying these monthly rents to, the NUG is trying to use Singaporean arbitration to say, no, that money should go to us, or at least it should be held in escrow for the people rather than going directly to the military's war efforts. Well, again, I don't think that the Singapore International Arbitration Center is going to be terribly friendly to the NUG. Venue shopping is very important. Let me give a different example. So the U.S. corporation Chevron sold their shares in offshore oil to a Canadian corporation. Now, Canada, to me, seems to be a much smarter place for some lawfare. My guess is the courts would be much more sympathetic to human rights concerns. Things like that. I don't know why they're not doing this in Europe. Singapore, I get it. The money, so much of the money goes through Singapore right now. But it's just not going to be a very sympathetic venue. We do need to think about different ways to block these monthly rents that go to the regime. It is their absolute lifeblood right now. Yes, there is still some foreign investment going into the country. They're still getting taxes. But remember, the military's economic incompetence, they're not growing the economy. They're not building the tax base. People are still not paying their electric bills. You have blackouts in Yangon for half the bloody day. So we know that the economic mismanagement is real, and their the cost of war is not cheap for them. We know the two military conglomerates have not paid dividends in the more than 2 years since the coup, right? So this is something that all soldiers have to purchase shares. It's taken out of their paycheck. They're not paying dividends on this. We know that there are some foreign investors who have left the country. It's not good news for the military. And that's why I've said in the previous paper I did for you, in the Stimson Center, I made the case that the real vulnerability for the regime was their handling of the economy. And that's what the NUG really, if they're thinking strategically, has to target. But yeah, we've got to stop this steady supply of funding that's getting to the regime.
That's really insightful, and it touches on the one of the core questions raised by a longtime observer who is based on the Thai-Myanmar border. I won't name him. And he actually raised the question that NUG needs to define what victory looks like, because currently this aiming at Tatmadaw soldiers and the killing of Tatmadaw soldiers is not necessarily going to lead to the victorious scenario that people are looking for. So what is the primary focus that the NUG should really prioritize in terms of their limited funding and in terms of a winning strategy? Do you have any recommendation or any analysis in this regard?
The NUG has identified their end state as a federal democracy with clear devolution of economic and political powers to the regions. There are some interesting discussions right now about redistricting the country, especially the Burma heartland, to take away some of the power from that and have smaller, more regionally focused, or governments that are more focused on regional issues to kind of dilute some of the power of that 60% of the country that is Burmese. So I think they do have that clear idea about what they want. I don't think they say it enough. I don't think and every time the NUG opens their mouth, they need to remain focused on what it is they're fighting for, because that is so important for maintaining the alliance with the different EAOs and keeping them focused about why we are fighting. There are other things that NUG has to constantly do. And I mentioned at the start, you look at their banking and fundraising, they have to present themselves as, this is the future of the country, what we're going to do. Do you want a bunch of Neanderthals running the banking sector into the ground, or do you want some tech savvy guys who have figured out how to do cryptocurrency and set up online banking system and, running the place? There are some really troubling human rights abuses being committed by PDF members right now, mistreatment of prisoners of war, rape of women. The NUG has to arrest this. I mean, the suspects, people who've perpetrated these crimes. This cannot go unpunished. It's not only the lawful thing to do, it's the strategic thing to do. Remember, the NUG is not going to win this war. They are not going to defeat the Sitat. They are not going to march into Naypyidaw. The best they can do is spread the military so thin, fighting across multiple fronts. They've never had to fight across so many different battlefields at the same time. They need to convince a handful, just a handful, of those one-star generals, senior colonels who are in charge of conducting this war, and have them, all the pressure coming down of Naypyidaw. You got to win. You got to do this. We need more victories now, faster, faster. And the guys who actually are running the war kind of say, it can't be done. We don't have enough troops. Our light infantry battalions are running significantly undermanned. They're not getting the resources they need. We can't deploy troops as quickly around the country. This is an unwinnable war. And, part of that strategy for the NUG is to encourage more defections. And the reality is the military is probably their most successful act has been staving off defections. That's probably been the most consequential thing they've done on the military front so far. They're not winning the war. They're terrorizing the population. They're not winning a war. And the NUG really needs to always hold themselves to a much higher standard. Now, with the Burmese military, that shouldn't be hard, because They're absolute thugs. But the NUG can never lose sight of what it is they're trying to do and what they're trying to accomplish. Reestablish the rule of law, reestablish competent economic management, reestablish minority rights, greater rights for women. This is so important. And let me just mention women right there. We've seen this incredible role of women, whether in the civil disobedience movement within the NUG, joining PDFs. We are witnessing a social revolution here, and to me, that's just it's so hopeful.
Thank you, Zach. I think it's really important that you point out what victory would look like in this case. Like you said, it's not a military victory over the Tatmadaw, which is unlikely to happen. Is to change the Tatmadaw from within through defections and through the changing of the minds and the norms within the Tatmadaw, is hopefully potentially someday to reach a I would hate to say compromise, that Tatmadaw realizes this cannot be won. And then hopefully there will be a peace process and some level of negotiation as for what the future of the country's government will look like. And last but not least, to show that NUG represents a better government with higher standard in terms of governance and in terms of the morality and in terms of what the government would and would not do. So hope that's helpful. Basically, one version of what victory should look like. We're running out of time, but there's an interesting question about, you mentioned that NUG is purchasing weapons on the black market basically 3 or 4 times the normal price. The normal price at the black market. So the question is there any way that NUG can purchase weapons from defense companies directly instead of having to pay this inflated price on the black market, or that is basically subject to the arms control treaties and the other regulations that we're faced with?
Right. There are no shortage of small arms producers around the world, and most of them are more than happy to sell to anyone, but getting the export licensing, the end user certificates through their governments is tricky. And then the whole question of how would you get them there? You know, the Thai government right now is certainly not going to be allowing the shipment of weapons across their soil. China, no. India, no. Bangladesh, no. So it's just not so easy. Right now, there is the black market. The Kachin and the Wa do produce weapons. They've been making knockoffs. They have their arms factories. But law of supply and demand. Demand's high right now. Prices are high. The money just doesn't go as far as it should. The NUG has been doing some of their own armaments production. I have seen some of their arms. Those are not weapons I would not want on my shoulder up against my head. And they have suffered losses, fatalities because of malfunctioning weapons. But I love how they take delight in the fact that when they knock over a Mytel cell tower, that they're using the steel to produce, their own howitzers and mortars and things like that. So there is creativity on the ground, but please remember, these are jungle workshops. They're doing a lot with very little. This is very rudimentary. The ammunition they produce has high rates of duds. So, this is, the military has those Kepasa factories and they're still churning stuff out. And they have economies of scale.
Well, Zach, I have to say that after discussion, I'm both more hopeful and also less hopeful about the prospect. You did list a number of ways that this could succeed, but it seems the conditions for this to work in the end is going to be extremely difficult to achieve. So if we can take a a strategic view or a 30,000 feet view at the current ongoing development in the country, I think the reality that we're faced with is that, well, this is going to be a prolonged war. This is going to be a prolonged war of attrition, and the advantages are unfortunately on the SAC's side. So would you say that Myanmar is returning to the past, basically the condition before 2010, before the whole democratic process all started, is just a poor country with very bad economic management and the ongoing civil wars that has been going for decades? But of course, now we know that one critical difference is that people's thinking are different now compared to before. But is that going to be critical enough to change the outcome?
I'm not a historian, and I'm not sure I'm the person to answer that question if we're going right back to 2010. To me, yes, it does look that way. But the population is different. You had 10 years of open society. You had economic growth, exposure, foreign investment pouring in. You have not just a middle class, but you had a real aspirational middle class there that is watching their future disappear. They've watched their savings wiped out through currency controls and high rates of inflation and devaluation of the kyat. So you have a very different population. You know, back in 2010, everyone was really poor. So there wasn't that sense that they had lost everything. So that's a big difference. But let me remind people what the country looks like if the NUG does not prevail and how dire. We're not going to go back to the country on January 31st, 2021, right? This is what the country looks like. Those large EAOs that have fought alongside the NUG, that have never, ever been fighting for independence, have every reason to reject autonomy with this military regime that could never be trusted and fight for independence. You're going to get further proliferation of those Chinese-dominated special economic zones along the border that are going to pour out drugs across Southeast Asia in record volumes, that are going to continue to be centers for human trafficking, money laundering, illegal casinos, wildlife trafficking, sex trafficking. You are going to have a military that's never going to be in full control of the country, at best 50%. So the country's prospects for growth will be diminished. You will still have a military in control of the economy, running the economy for not the public, but for the military to support their war efforts and their sheer rapaciousness, their greed of those generals. And finally, what's going to happen to those PDFs? Let me tell you. They're going to break down into armed gangs. That discipline will be lost. This is a very, very grim picture of what Myanmar looks like should the military prevail. And that's why it's incumbent, not just on the international community, to support the NUG and give them the support they need. This is not a matter of internal affairs. What happens in Myanmar is not going to stay in Myanmar. And we need to be much more serious and proactive about supporting the NUG. They do have a defined end state, and we have to help them get them there. The people of Myanmar deserve it.
Well, thank you, Zach. We are at the end of our hour. Thank you so much for the insightful analysis. I have received a lot of positive comments in the Q&A, and people really thank you for the analysis that you have presented here today, and also the futures and what was necessary for this to succeed. So we thank everybody for joining us for this discussion today. We hope to continue to have your attention for our future discussions about the development inside Myanmar. For our next event, it will be at the beginning of July, and it will be with the president of Parami Institute, one of the only surviving private higher education institutions in the country. So with that, we wish you have a very good day or very good evening if you're in Asia, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks for having me.